Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, which sometimes I like to refer to as every B'nai Mitzvah kid's least favorite book of the Torah. They have bated breath thinking that maybe their Torah portion is going to be Noah and the Ark and the flood or the Ten Commandments or, Moses. And instead they have line after line of ritual sacrifice and bloody offerings, right? The theme, I think, which should come as no surprise, is really this theme of sacrifice. And so we're going to read a little bit of the text, and then I thought hopefully engage in a conversation about this idea of sacrifice, what it meant to our ancestors, and what it might mean to us. I think that, many of the Torah portions in Leviticus, much of Leviticus, particularly this whole idea of these, ritual, particularly the animal sacrifices, offerings, are so easy to just dismiss as being ancient or archaic and having little to do with us in 2023. But I don't know, maybe there's more to it than that. So I'm going to share my screen. All right. Did that work? Yeah, everybody can see. Okay. All right. Anybody want to read this little chunk from our Parshat for us?
You can read.
Thank you.
So that the children of Israel may bring their sacrifices, which they sacrifice in the open field, that they may bring them unto the Lord, unto the door of the tent of the meeting, unto the priest, and sacrifice them for sacrifices of peace offerings unto the Lord. And the priest shall dash the blood against the altar of the Lord at the door of the tent of the meeting, and make the fat smoke for a sweet savor unto the Lord. And they shall no longer sacrifice their sacrifices unto the satyrs, after whom they go astray. Could you scroll down a little bit? Thank you. This shall be the statute forever unto them throughout their generations.
Okay. So a couple of questions. Hopefully people are thinking about these two questions. So what's the point here? Why are our ancestors bringing these sacrifices? Cindy.
Well, first
nice
of all,
to see you, by the way.
Pardon?
Nice to see you, by the way.
You too. By doing the sacrifices, the end effect is they got food, especially for the priests. But in my opinion, that by having the smoke rise up, that they felt that was the only way they could reach God, and that God, it was their connection to God.
Yep. Okay. Rebecca, I saw a hand.
My feeling is that I'm just making a supposition that maybe a lot of people to bring in an animal was a big deal, that they didn't have much means to begin with, and that the sacrifice really represented a kind of a big give, representing life, that life is special. I don't know.
No, beautiful. It's interesting. Not this particular piece that we're looking at right now, but in many other places, in this Parshat and others, the stipulation is made that the animal that is brought be without blemish, right? That it be the no such thing as perfection, right? But the closest thing to perfection. That it be the very best of the herd. In other words, the animal that would have fetched the most at market, right? The most valuable animal that, you're right, Rebecca, exactly right, was incredibly precious to them. And that was what they're meant to sacrifice, right? We could get into a whole argument about, I would argue potentially that that's what makes it a sacrifice, right? If you give the runty, calf that you're not going to be able to even sell at market, I mean, is that really a sacrifice, right? So I think that's absolutely a piece of it. And yes, Lorraine, as you mentioned, I see your hand up. It's sort of the, the ancient barbecue, right? That this was a gathering. This was that the people would gather at the temple. In this case, the animal was sacrificed. And absolutely, this was the way that the priests and the Levites and those in the temple, got something to eat. I'm going to come back to this idea of the smoke being pleasing to God, because that language gets used in a few places, and we're going to look at a text in a minute that hits on that. Lorraine, and then Roy, and then Merle.
I just wanted to comment on Cindy's comment at the start. That's precisely what I was speaking about related to this Parsha with my kids this morning, because we're obviously sacrifices is just so foreign, and especially when you're talking about it with kids, they're like, well, and sacrifices, we talk about how different that is. And they asked me about the smoke, and precisely I said, well, I guess it's how you elevate, I guess, a prayer, and it's a smoke, and then it carries, and it just connects, your connects with God. So I also thought about it that way, that the smoke was a means of communication. But in terms of the sacrifice, wasn't not everybody had to sacrifice. I mean, the most treasured item. I think that if you didn't have the means, you could bring something else, like
absolutely,
flour, even something smaller, right?
But I think the key phrase that you just mentioned is if you don't have the means. So whatever if you don't have, what is prescribed to bring, there's an alternative. But whatever it is you're bringing is most likely something that is valuable and precious to you. Roy.
I'm going to try and just sort through the logic of my argument.
Good to see you.
Same. I'm curious what about the use of the word Seder for one, because that's typically a word I see used regarding to Greek mythology, and also what you see on like Greek vases.
Mm-hmm.
But from that, what I'm seeing is that so they're no longer sacrificed to Seders, and I sort of read that as being more kind of the Jews are in a process of elevating their beings. They're moving from being more animalistic and moving into the world of the mind and ethics and morals. And so by no longer sacrificing to the kind of real primal aspects of existence, they're now going to be adopting the ethics and morals of God and moving into a process of higher holiness, so to speak.
Yeah, so the Hebrew, can you guys see if I highlight here? Does that come up? Yeah, okay. So that's the Hebrew, right? Reach nikoach, right? Is this phrase that I actually think sweet savor is this is a kind of a little bit archaic translation. It's sweet smelling, sweet sweet odor. And it's funny, I think that I was actually thinking about this when I looked at this morning. In the context of the weather we've been having, and I've been lighting fires in the wood burning fires in the fireplace more often than usual. Which my neighbor commented to me the other day. He said, "Oh, I went out in the front yard the other day, and clearly you were burning a fire because it smelled so good." Right. So that I think we sometimes think of this as maybe odd, but who doesn't love a good barbecue or a good fire? Brad, and then Cindy.
Hi, Rabbi. I'm on a different wavelength here. I'm thinking of this imagery of the fat smoke rising, and that image to me is almost of a cloud. And I can't help but think of our Torah portion from last week, where God descended as a cloud into the tabernacle. So we have God descending as a cloud, and then we have a human sacrifice, which is rising as a cloud up to God. So this cloud imagery seems to me to be pretty powerful. I'm not sure. I don't know how to make sense of it all, but I find it interesting.
No, I think there's an interesting, either parallel or corollary there for sure. Certainly in the imagery. Cindy, I'm going to let you go, and then I want to push us forward with another question. Cindy, you're muted.
I'm not sure if this is a question or a comment, but here it says about dashing the blood against the altar. It says it many other places. And my image of all this dried blood in the hot desert, I mean, wouldn't it be putrid after a while?
Probably, right? I mean, there's certainly lots of blood ritual that gets that is a part of these sacrifices and how blood is meant to be treated, which, you know, is usually interpreted. You know, our ancestors had a deep respect, reverence, and sanctity for the sanctity of blood, right?
But I don't see any place where they're cleaning it.
Right. But blood has this power. So not in this verse, right? But it's usually, it was collected in a sort of basin beside the altar. Part of that also is that the blood has to be removed from the animal, right? You can't consume blood traditionally. Panina, I see your hand.
All right. So I am looking at the last paragraph in Hebrew, and it says here that they shouldn't bring their sacrifices anymore to the old idols that they did before.
Correct.
In other words, what happens here is Moses, when he's giving them all these guidelines, he is actually using old habits and old, how would I say, the meaning of it, but wherever it is that they knew already, this time it's being channeled into the idea of the one God that they cannot see and they cannot feel, but the feeling toward it is trying to use old habits to emphasize the new God. And it says it. And they shouldn't do it anymore to the Seirim. I guess they did some kind of animals or even people that they were, he calls it actually to be zonim achreim. Zona is a prostitute. So it's like the idols that they actually prostitute themselves after no longer be the one that they sacrifice to now, but still the emphasis is using old methods to bring them close to the new idea of the God that they cannot see.
Panina, it's as if you were reading ahead in what I have in my notes here. So with that in mind, right?
Look at that where it says the last sentence.
Yeah.
And they should not bring it anymore to the ones they were substituting themselves before. And it should be forever. I mean, don't go back ever.
Right. So this notion, right, of sacrifice was not something unique to our ancestors, right? This was commonplace in pagan, Canaanite society, right? So, and your point about, so they're saying no more to those idols, to those gods, right? Here's just from the Psalms a little bit, right? Somebody want to read this, just kind of articulating the position on the idols of others?
Here, I will. Their idols are silver and gold, the work of man's hands. They have mouths, but they speak not. Eyes have they, but they see not. They have ears, but they hear not. Noses have they, but they smell not. You need to scroll up.
That's it.
Oh, okay.
Right. So, in other words, they're nothing, right? It's meaningless. It's a waste to be sacrificing to this. Okay. So before we hit the next text, what do we think about this idea of, maybe these sacrifices being an attempt to rechannel or reappropriate what was familiar to our
exactly
people?
Yep.
All right, let's do this. Skip ahead a little bit to.
So if they bring these sacrifices that are nothing, does that equal bringing your most perfect non-blemished cow or animal or whatever? You also don't have to get rid of any blood.
Well, explain to me sacrifices that are nothing.
Well, what I just read
Right.
Where-
Well, that's saying that those idols, those idols,
that's right.
right,
Okay.
not that the sacrifice is nothing, but bringing that sacrifice to an idol is
Right.
meaningless, right?
Okay.
And it's juxtaposed with, as Penina pointed out, bringing it to the temple, and it's for God, not for,
Right.
Zeus.
Okay.
What have you.
That makes more sense.
Okay, so this is a bit of midrash here. Really, exactly, Penina, as if you read ahead. And I'll go ahead and read it. So this is Vayikra Rabbah. Rabbi Pinchas, in the name of Rabbi Levi, stated, "This is comparable to a king's son who strayed and was accustomed to eating non-kosher meat. The king declared, 'Let him always eat at my table, and on his own, he will eventually become disciplined.' Similarly, because Israel was attached to idolatry in Egypt and would bring their sacrifices to the goat demons, and retribution would befall them, the Holy One, blessed be God, said, 'Let them offer sacrifices before me,' instead, is implied, right, 'at all times in the tent of meeting, and they will be separated from idolatry and will be saved.' This is the meaning of what is written. Any man of the house of Israel who slaughters an ox or sheep or goat and does not bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting as a sacrifice to God, that man will be cut off from among his people, so that they no longer offer their sacrifices to the goat demons, and that they won't go astray, that they won't to stray after, right? And with this is the prohibition that these sacrifices can only happen at the temple in Jerusalem. Now, there's plenty of evidence that people had altars in their backyard and were doing who knows what, but that was not, condoned. This was an attempt to centralize all of this that was going on. Everybody, as the expression goes, making Shabbos for themselves. No, right? This is going to happen here. We're going to get a handle on it. What do we think about this?
The focus point, right?
Rabbi, may I say something?
Please, Donna, how are you?
Oh, good. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat
I'm
shalom.
okay. I just love Betty White and love animals, and I have a hard time with this, but I understand that it was part of our commandments back then, but we're not reinstituting the sacrifices, and I'm grateful that we're not, because we're supposed to care for the animals, but this was a commandment at that time. How do you feel about that comment? I mean, I love animals. It's illegal to hurt them. I can't stand the thought of hurting an animal, but I do understand that this is part of our ancient history, but we're not going to be doing it anymore. And I'm glad that we're not.
Yeah, look, I think that's absolutely, raises a, ethical, moral conflict and dilemma, right? And look, if we go back to Genesis, the very beginning of Genesis, in one instance, Adam is told that he is meant to rule over the earth, rule over all the animals on the planet. And, a few dozen verses later, Adam is told to care for and tend to all the animals on the planet. And there are many who observe that those two things are not the same, right? To have dominion over, to be master of, and to care for and nurture are not the same. And that's sort of the balance in a way that that we're meant to have, in a world, until recently, in which we now know that you don't need to eat animal proteins to be healthy and whatnot. But for most of human history, people thought you did. How do we balance the need to kill animals for our own survival with this imperative to care for animals and care for our planet? One could argue that kashrut is an attempt to bring balance to that, right? And yes, I'm with you. I'm very happy that my job is giving sermons and not sacrificing goats on the sanctuary. I'd probably do something else for a living if it were. Go ahead, Merle, and then Brad.
I guess my big question is if you bring an animal for sacrifice and outside it looks like it's absolutely perfect, and then when it becomes a sacrifice and they cut it open and there might be a spot that's not so perfect, do you throw this animal away? Do you give it to the poor people to eat? I mean, do you just toss it like it's not perfect so it can't be a sacrifice?
Great question. I don't actually know the answer to it. I'm confident in saying that it was not thrown away.
Okay. I mean, that makes me feel better. It kind of goes with not harming animals too. I mean, I'm kind of like, these people don't have a lot of money and they're wandering the desert and they give you their one animal and it turns out not to be perfect. It looked perfect in your eyes, but then somebody got it and it's not. Where does it go? I mean, it's always been a problem for me.
Brad and then Penina.
I think this poses this important question: how do you break a bad habit? And what it's saying is you break a bad habit by practicing a new one. Where it says, let him always eat at my table, and on his will, he will eventually become disciplined, in that first paragraph. So practice precedes belief, in other words. Just by practicing these habits, a virtuous behavior will ensue. And that was a very common thought in the ancient world. I mean, that was the Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle. The way you become virtuous is you practice virtue. So I think this is an interesting concept, that the practice precedes the belief. It's by practicing that we will get there.
Which is, we talked about this a few weeks ago, right? I mean, that's the whole concept, na'aseh v'nishma, right? That our ancestors, that's the response when receiving the Torah, we will do and we will understand, right? Which the sermon every rabbi is given 100 times is, oh, that seems backwards, right? First we understand, then we do. Well, no, there are lots of things, right? That it is only in the doing that we come to understand. I think, Brad, it's also an interesting point that to go to the example here from the Midrash of the king and his son who's out there eating treif, and the king says, you want to eat treif, fine, but come eat the treif at my table. And eventually you'll decide that, being around other people who are not, you'll decide that that's not what you want to do. Maybe, as you said, Brad, their virtue will rub off on you. But I think it's also trying to get a handle on that behavior and saying, well, if you're going to do it, I want to know about it, kind of thing, right? Like I'm thinking of parents who tell their kids, fine, you're 19, and if you want to have a beer, that's fine, but I want to, ask me. Don't just go out in the woods with your friends and drink a 6-pack or what have you. Sort of a harm reduction model, if it were. Go ahead, Penina.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so two great things happen as a result of all this process. First of all, we don't do this anymore. We have prayer. So human beings actually prove themselves to be smarter and more sensitive, and there is a lot more deduction in what they are doing and what they are thinking. So number one, we don't do it, we pray. This is the replacement, direct replacement of the sacrifices. Number two, today, when I was growing up, I was going with my school to, we called it Aliyah LaRegel, which is like a pilgrimage, but we didn't go all the way to Jerusalem. I lived in Tel Aviv. So we went to there were temples. Some of them were like more central temple, Bet HaKnesset HaGadol, they call it, the big temple. Then there were smaller temples around. We would go and decide to go to one that will be close to our orphanage. We would bring baskets, but the basket wouldn't have any meat in them. They would have fruits, vegetables, and challahs. So there was also within the younger generation this idea that you're supposed to be doing things with the common sense and more humane way to impress or express what you feel. And if you want to give and you want to do presents in the name of God, you do it in a humane. Actually, before the bread, they used to bring to the temple doves, birds. So the animal, like the sheep and cows, no more. It was doves and fruits and vegetables and wheat. And then in my time, even the dove was out of the basket. It was bread, vegetables, and fruit. Mm-hmm. So Dana, you can rest in peace. It's not happening anymore. Okay.
certainly not happening anymore. Rebecca.
This feeds off of what Brad said, in that in the process of doing, they also had to do it with intention. Intention meaning the perfect animal, the unblemished animal. So then it took also out of another realm of polytheism and moving it more towards monotheism.
I just want to tell Panina, thank you. I hope I rest in peace many years from now, though.
Okay, sweet.
Rebecca, that's an interesting point. So, which sort of in my mind begs the question, right? Who are the sacrifices really for? Right? Or is it for God? You know, does God need this pleasing odor? Is it for us? Is it both? God's, I mean, if we take the text at its word, God's asking for them. But is God asking for them, you know, because we need them or we want them? Susan, you're muted.
Yes.
There we go.
Essentially, it is for the people, but it's also for the Levite priests, because they can't, I mean, this is practical. They don't have property, and
Correct.
they ate it. They ate the fruits or vegetables later, the Panina said, but they ate the meat too. And you could look at it as a psychological thing also for the people. There's a sin, there were different types. There's a sin offering, you felt guilty about something, a gratitude offering. So I think it was a psychological thing for the people. We don't know whether God loved it. We have no way of, they had no way of knowing.
Nor do we.
So it would be for the people and practically for feeding the priests.
Right. In terms of the feeding the priest, right? You can almost think of it as a tax.
Yes. And in terms of
and the tax was like done exactly like that. They will give cows as a tax.
Yeah.
And it's on the last month of the year before Rosh Hashanah. 4 times a year there was different tax given. And before Rosh Hashanah was the tax of the meat. And they would bring cow. On Passover, no, not. On Tu B'Shvat, it was the fruit of the tree. They would bring some of that. That would be also a way of paying taxes. And then on Shavuot, they would bring wheat and barley. That was another head of the year, tax time. And that's what they brought. Whatever was going at that time, that was significant to the time, that wasn't meat, and meat, they would celebrate. There were 4 head of the year on the Jewish calendar.
So I'm going to push the question a little further, though. For God or for us?
I think it was God telling us what we needed to do to help those who needed help.
And to help ourselves become farmers.
Ourselves included. But
Yeah.
a way of teaching people to give a sacrifice for some sort of repentance.
Or as Susan points out, gratitude.
Right.
Right.
It fits into that whole gamut.
Right.
I don't think there's an answer. I think it goes across the board.
Well, so here's right, and this is, most of us here we're all veterans, so I don't think this will be news to anyone, right? That the Hebrew word korban for sacrifice, right? The same root as the word karov, which means to draw close, right?
Right.
The idea of sacrifice is about drawing close to God, drawing God close to us, right? In that relationship, which I think, begs the question then, which Rabbi Leader is fond of asking, and I'll ask it because I like it as well, which is to say, I think it would be easy to say, well, they sacrificed because, God was important to them, right? Or if we look in our lives, right? We all, not animals, right? But we sacrifice for things that matter to us, for our families, for our careers, for all sorts of things, right? Do we sacrifice for those things because they are so important to us and they mean so much to us? Or is it the other way around? do those things mean so much to us because we have sacrificed so much for them? Is the reason our careers or our families mean so much to us because we have had to sacrifice so much for them?
No, I think it's because we love our families and we want our careers.
Right.
I think it's because we love them that we do what we do.
Okay.
By the way, Sukkot.
And by the way,
is
it doesn't
the
have to be binary. I mean, I'm not suggesting that it's binary.
Yeah. Sukkot is the fourth head of the year. That's for the winter vegetables. Aliyah LaRegel, the 4 times a year. Okay.
Because one could also argue, right, this is God saying, right, make these sacrifices, you know, so that you will draw close to me, so that I will be, you know, central in your life, so that I will matter.
Right.
And I think that we're taught this today by when we make a donation, we choose a place. I mean, that's a sacrifice to a lot of people. But you make a donation to an agency or some place that's
You
important.
only give money to the temple.
Well, yeah, and I narrow it down I do that and narrow it down even further. So, but you're choosing some place where that money, or somebody might say it's a sacrifice depending on what kind of money they have.
But that's also right. I think it's the same question though, in a way, right? Okay, do you, you know, write a check to whatever the organization is because,
Right.
you know, you care about their mission and they're important to you, obviously. And again, I don't think it's mutually exclusive. And do you care about that organization because you have skin in the game?
Right.
Right? Because, right, I mean, everyone in the nonprofit world knows this, right? You put somebody on the board and they're going to care more about the organization, right? You give them ownership of it, right? You get
Exactly.
them to make a contribution. They have skin in the game. And then it becomes more important to them. And then hopefully they give more, right?
That's true.
It's right. So
It's very true.
it goes both ways. I think it's easy to always think about it as we sacrifice for, but I think, you know, there's another piece of it too, which is those things gain greater meaning. We draw even closer to them, perhaps. Because
And there are some organizations where you have to make a substantial donation in order to be a part of that organization.
Right. And we're not going to argue the merits of that
No, but I think that's
a
version of what we're talking about.
Yeah, for sure. Brad.
If you carry that analogy further, first of all, I don't think we know whether God, how do we know whether it pleases? I guess some in the Torah you could say that, but you give to an organization, I know when I give, it feels good. I like what they're doing. Now, what if that organization starts falling off the wagon or starts not going in another direction?
Yeah.
Then what? And then what if God doesn't hear your pleas and things start turning around? I mean, the Holocaust is the perfect example. Then what?
Right. Yeah, there are plenty examples, right, where, well, I wanted this to happen and it didn't, or this horrible thing happened and now what, right? Brad, I'm gonna get you in just a second. We're gonna read this last little text here. Someone want to read this? Because this is lest we feel that we're the first to wrestle with this. We are not.
The basic difference in attitude to the sacrificial system may be summarized thus. In the school of Rabbi Ishmael, the view was, not for my sake do you offer sacrifices, but for your sakes, to satisfy your needs. For my part, I am pleased that having given you the commandments, you fulfill my will, and I shall reward you. In the school of Rabbi Akiva, the view was, I desire nothing else but the sacrifices. Their sweet savor brings delight to me.
Right. With no answer.
Mm-mm.
And again, I would say I don't think it's binary. I think maybe it's both. Right. Maybe it's for God and certainly for us as well. Brad.
Well, you know, I think the Well, I think the sacrifices are for our benefit. And the purpose, if we look up above and here as well, is that it's a breaking a bad habit. It is through the sacrifice that we separate ourselves from idolatry. That's what it says in that quote above. Let them offer sacrifices before me and at all times in the tent of meeting, and they will be separated from idolatry and be saved. So the starting point for us is to first separate ourselves from idolatry, break that habit. And once we break that habit, we can then open ourselves up to God, but we can't do it until we first break the habit, and we break the habit through sacrifice.
Brad, can you write that up for me? I need to start tomorrow morning. No, it's beautifully put, right? And I think it's baby steps, right? It's saying, okay, I'm not going to tell you you can't do these ridiculous sacrifices that are foolish. I'm going to tell you can't do them here, and you can't direct them at something else. But if they're so important to you, fine. You know, you can keep doing them, but I'm going to put some parameters around it, kind of get a handle on it, right? So it's not, going off the rails here.
But what do we get? What do we get out of it? What does the person who sacrifices gain from the sacrifice specifically?
Great question. So, one could argue they're getting a connection to God in this case, right? They're getting, sort of feeling like they've checked the box.
It just seems like a membership card or something, but it doesn't. I mean, you have it in your wallet, but then what do you get into? What do you use it for?
Well, I think it's the same thing. So this is an interesting way. Penina alluded to this earlier, right? These that we just read, these strict prescriptions around, that these sacrifices can only happen here in the tent of meeting, in and of itself, in a way, creates the cataclysmic catastrophe in the wake of the destruction of the Second Temple. Because now what do? It's not, we know we can't offer these sacrifices anywhere else. So what do? Right? And ultimately, prayer gets invented, and prayer directly replaces sacrifice. So the same thing could be, asked there, Eric, right? What does one get out of prayer? Well, I think you'd get a different answer from different people. But, communing with that which is greater than we, some connection to something larger, perhaps, right? Which again, if we go back to this notion of just the etymology of the words and the linguistics of it, that sacrifices this notion of drawing close to God, the argument would be, that's what our ancestors got from it, was relationship with God. And that is the reward for it in and of itself. I will just to go ahead, Penina, and then I'm going to push this a little further.
Okay. The first thing that happened is no human sacrifices.
Right.
It's a big step.
Right. Some argue that the entire story of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac,
it was a lesson. No more human sacrifices.
Right. It's meant to say all those other people, this is what they do. This is not, Abraham, you got this wrong. You thought that this is what you're supposed to do because that's what everybody else does. Absolutely not.
No. So
we don't do that.
This is a big step. That no human sacrifices. That's the most important thing. Second, they become a community. They are together there. They are taking care of each other. They are eating together. They are taking care of the priest. There is here something that's not selfish. You give, and you also together in that place. So the whole idea was to become a new nation, a nation that believes in this unseen God, and they were supposed to look for him in proper ways, in other ways, not idols. So I think this is a big step. Number one, the human sacrifices, they were out. That's it. Okay, that's it.
And I think, it's interesting. I'll pick on my dad again. I do that sometimes. And maybe he's watching.
Well,
But the right, and he, I mean, many others, right, will ask, well, do you, why does God, what kind of God is so petty or focused on the minutia that he or she needs us to make sacrifices to them, or to pray, to them, which I think gets back to this question of, is it for God or is it for us? And perhaps it's God's way and our way of saying, like, here we are, these humans with finite minds attempting to comprehend that which is infinite. And these, just like all the metaphor throughout the Machzor and throughout the Siddur, these are tools to help us, right? God says, okay, you need this, fine. And then I'll give it to you. If you want, then I recognizing what you need, this can become a part of our relationship.
Is it practical?
Well, so one more midrash on that very point, and then we'll keep chatting. Someone want to read this?
Before they read, can I say goodbye to everybody? I fractured my rib and I got to rest. I want to say Shabbat Shalom. I love everybody.
Shabbat Shalom, Donna. Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
All right, anybody? Okay, I'll read. No worries. So why did they want the entire ritual of the tabernacle? Right, meaning everything that happens in the sacrament. The people said to the Holy One, the Holy and Blessed One, Master of the universe, the sovereigns of all the nations have a tent, a table, a menorah, incense offerings. Every king has need for those rituals in his kingdom. You are our sovereign, our redeemer, our savior. Should you not have all these rituals of kingship so that all the nations of the world will know that you are our sovereign? The Holy One replied, they who are flesh and blood need all this, but I do not need it. I have no need for food or drink, and I do not require any light. My servants can testify to that. The sun and the moon, which illumine the whole earth, they get their light from me. However, the people continued to entreat God. So God finally said to them, my children, if you feel this way, then do as you please. But you must do it only in accordance with my instructions. Build me a house as it is written, and they shall make me a sanctuary. Also a menorah, a table, and an altar on which to offer incense. Thoughts?
It's good they had open communication.
I like that, Eric. Yeah. And also saying, look, okay, if this is what I hear you, right? This is what you need. I hear you.
It's also a teaching.
Say more.
That this, if you want from me, I need for you to be there for me. It's like a two-way street.
Be there for me. How?
Well, this is what I expect you to provide for me, so that I know you want me to be there for you. It's the connection between you and God.
It's relationship, if you think about
Right.
it, right? Which we call it the covenantal relationship, right? But the, particularly in Torah, certainly, but the way almost every Jewish theology thinks about God is in relationship with people, and that it is a two-way street. Rebecca, I think I saw your hand.
I have two things. One is an image, in that it's that the relationship is cyclical. So there's a constant flow. And then the other thing that comes to mind is a word, and the word is acknowledgement. When you give a donation, when you give a sacrifice, you're acknowledging that group or that person. It's a way of offering support. But the word that comes to me is acknowledgement of the existence of that.
Of the other side, or the other entity. Yeah.
And this came right after the 10 Commandments, you have to remember.
Right.
So there is
That's a great point.
Yeah.
That we also have to think of all of this as
fulfilling the
identity formation, for lack of a better phrase, right? Our people are still infants, right? Growing and maturing from from slaves to free people who ultimately, are ready to lead themselves and be in a different, I would argue, a different kind of relationship with God. They're not ready for that yet. They're not ready for that yet. Cindy, go ahead.
I agree with what everyone's saying, that the rituals help you feel connected to God and that you're pleasing God. They also, like lighting a Hanukkah, it's a commandment of God, but it helps you feel connected to your Judaism, to your community, especially when they're communal things like a Seder. But I keep thinking about Isaiah, who talked a lot like it's not all about the ritual. It's more about being a good person and doing mitzvot.
Yes. Right. Yeah. Don't sit here and do X, Y, and Z and claim other. It's an interesting point, Cindy, as you just said that to me, sort of this idea of feeling, I have a friend who says, the more you do Jewish, the more you feel Jewish. Right.
Right.
So, I promise this is not a pitch to come to services tonight. But it's wonderful if you do. Right. But it's a sacrifice to show up at 6 o'clock on a Friday night and give an hour or so of your time plus travel time and traffic and the aggravation and all of that. Hopefully you get something out of it, right? Hopefully that sacrifice, results in a meaningful experience, a connection to, we can put God to the side for a second, but a connection at least to something greater than ourselves, to community, to Judaism, to tradition, to ritual. Is that so different? Brad.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting passage because it says that God agrees to the sacrifice, to the menorah, to the sanctuary very begrudgingly. Yeah. He says, I don't need any of this stuff, but if it's
if you need
it, well, I mean, I'll go along with it. As long as you do it in accordance with my instructions. Right. So
I'd rather you don't do this, but if you have to do it, at least do it, this way.
Exactly.
It sort of reminds me of the old kashrut joke about Moses and God said, right, don't boil a calf in its mother's milk. And Moses, goes on and on and on about all the different restrictions we've come up with around milk and meat together. And God finally says, okay, have it your way. Right. Like if that's how you want to do it, that's your business. Like, I don't need that. I need, much less.
But again, I mean, the message here is that these sacrifices are not for God. They're for us.
Right. And we have a couple more
texts. God says he doesn't need this.
Correct. Right. And here we go. Right. Look at Hosea. Right. For I desire mercy and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. Right. Or here from Talmud, right. From Masechet Brachot, which I think is beautiful, right? That prayer is greater than the sacrifices. Who mentioned Isaiah a minute ago? I forget now. Right?
Yes.
Yeah, opinion, right? Right. To what purpose is the multitude of your sacrifices to me, says God? I'm full of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fed beasts, and I delight not in the blood of bullocks or of lambs or of he goats. Like, enough already, right? This is for you, not for me. And last but not least, a lovely little ditty, one of my personal favorites, that one who performs, tzedakah, one who engages in tzedakah is worthier than the one who offers all the sacrifices. We could argue, I would argue, are those actually two different things? I mean, tzedakah, depending on what form it takes, we were just talking about it a few minutes ago, is you could certainly argue as a sacrifice in its own right, in a certain way. Thoughts?
Well, I think that was the message of most of the prophets. I mean, you mentioned Hosea and Isaiah, but other prophets said the same thing.
Oh, yeah.
What do we need? So that it kind of concludes our discussion, and certainly after the destruction of the temple in 70, the rabbis came in and they had the biggest dilemma of what to do. And is this what God wants? And I think they solved it beautifully. I mean, you have to give
right. I mean, the argument can be made that based on this rationale, okay, God's saying, well, look, the sacrifices are for you. If you need them, great. So then if they can't be offered anymore, I wasn't in the room. I can imagine the rabbis, Yohanan ben Zakkai and the others in the first century saying, well, if it's for us, then prayer is going to work for us now, right? It's a new chapter in our relationship with God. If God doesn't care, if God says, fine, do what you want, as long as it's not violating other stipulations, other rules, other commandments. So the rabbi's saying, fine, it doesn't need to be sacrificed for us anymore, ritual sacrifice. It's going to be prayer, and that's going to serve our need. And I would make the same argument that God does not need us to pray to God. I mean, that's, I think, ridiculous, right? We pray for us, for ourselves, for the same reasons, to feel connected to something larger.
Also preservation, the preservation of the nation, because people fought each other in the name of their gods and killed each other.
Still do.
Yeah. Nations fought other nations, but with the name of their God. And it's still happening today, unfortunately. And believing in that one God supposedly also brings unity and gave them life as people, life as a nation. So this is something that people a lot of times forget. They look more into tangible things for reasons, but people use the name of God for do horrible things.
All sorts of things,
And literally, like I said, nations were wiped off the earth because of those wars. What happened even in Europe during the Ottoman Empire? They were killing each other, and the Jews actually, by the way, always followed the Muslims because they were more understanding and more peaceful and lived and gave the Jews shelter, while the Inquisition was actually putting them to death by the name of God. So this is what I'm trying to
look, and we can look at the Crusades. I mean, there's far too many examples.
Yes.
Unfortunately, still today,
absolutely.
Of all sorts of things.
Right.
I think I saw one more hand, and then
I think that what you said earlier is that it's a sacrifice for us to show up. And in today's world, it's however we show up. I can't be there every week, so I show up on Facebook, or whatever it is. But it's still a sacrifice of time,
which is our most precious resource.
And you are you're doing it for hopefully the right intention. But I think that I think all of this in this discussion today is also a modernization of what it used to be, where our lives are different now than they were. Our lives are different now than they were 2.5 years ago. And we show up in whatever way we can. And I think that that's an important thing to realize, that it is a sacrifice, that you're telling people, no, I mean, we're either at temple here or at temple there, or at temple here and on Zoom at the same time, which our rabbi knows that my phone is, in my purse or, my backpack, and then I'm in 2 places at once. But that's the advantage we have of wanting to be there. And I look at people, I mean, it kind of goes back to post-bar mitzvah syndrome. People that think that really, as a Jewish professional, this is something that's always been on my brain, that they were there when they had to be. When somebody said, well, you have to be here. And when your kid has to be bar bat mitzvah, then all of a sudden they disappear for whatever reason. And I think that's a big piece of it, that they have their own way of celebrating whatever holidays it is. We've asked people, you're welcome to come to our house for Pesach. Oh no, we're going to go to the deli where they have a Seder, and so I've just moved on from that issue and do what I have to do, or what we have to do, to maintain that connection to our Judaism.
Look, I think it beautifully put, Merle, and I think connection is really, to sum it up in one word. I'm not being cute when I say thank you all for sacrificing, the last hour to learn together. No, really, I mean, it is a sacrifice.
It's not a sacrifice.
It's not, though. If you want to do it,
it's not a sacrifice.
You are sacrificing your time.
No, we should.
It's our pleasure.
Right.
I'll say it in a different way. Thank you for being generous with your time. But I would also argue, because almost almost, I think, in fact, everyone here are in the kind of core group of regulars here every Friday. I would argue that this, Friday Torah Zoom holds the meaning it does for many of us because you have decided to be here week after week, right?
Yes.
If you popped in
Right.
for 1 week and then didn't for 6 months, it wouldn't have much meaning to you.
Correct.
But
That's
because
good.
you have prioritized it and put and invested in it with your time, I think that's
Well, I would interrupt you, but I want to thank you. Because if we want to be here, I mean, for me, it's not a sacrifice. For me, I look forward to it. I put it on the calendar. And
Right.
I do for other rabbis whom I like communicating with. So I turn that around. If it were a sacrifice for me, I would stop. But it's because something I want to do, and I appreciate your taking the time to give us a meaningful discussion. So that's
thank
the
you.
Exactly.
Well, I'll just end by
Exactly.
saying that as far as I'm concerned, we're all lucky to be here and lucky to have each other to learn with.
And
Yes.
thank you, Hannah, for making this happen all week long and every.
Shabbat shalom, everybody. Have a
Thank
wonderful
you.
Shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
And it's not a sacrifice. It's a pleasure.
It is a pleasure.
right. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you all.